Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and hi to everyone who's joining this session. I'm hugely excited to welcome you to the second session of the UCL Beyond Boundaries conference to discuss universities and the Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs are of critical importance to UCL and to universities and higher education institutes all around the world. How can we, as a community of researchers, of teachers, as a collection of assets and buildings and brains in places, and as an innovative international public sector ecosystem, respond to these, the world's greatest challenges? My name is Martha McPherson. I'm head of Green Economy and Sustainable Growth here at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL. I've been asked to chair this session as a provocative and a challenging discussion. I've got 6 fantastic people here to help me do so. Now is not the time just to sit on our laurels and to be very proud of what we've done in the higher ed sector, engaging with the SDGs. Universities have done amazing work, but it's also time to think through how should we interact, engage, and be activists for Agenda 2030 for the next 8 years. We've got 1 hour, 30 minutes, and we've got 6 expert panelists here with a range of various knowledge and experience from different universities and non-university institutes from around the world. I'm going to introduce you quickly, if everyone can just wave and say hi when I introduce you, and then we'll get down to business. So we've got Adriana Allen from the Bartlett here at UCL. We've got Aromar Revi from the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. We've got Phil Baty here from Times Higher Education.
Hello.
We've got Tanya Dudnikova, who's a recent UCL alumna.
Hi.
We've got Duncan Ivison, who's joining us from his evening in the University of Sydney. And we've got Tristan McCowan from the Institute of Education, also here at UCL.
Great to be here.
Thank you all for coming so much. I'm really looking forward to talking to each of you. So now each of the panelists, we asked them beforehand to put together a 5-minute video before the session to share a kind of opening statement with their thoughts, their challenges, and their concerns. And these videos are really interesting and super kind of well worth watching in full. After the end of this session, they'll be up on the UCL YouTube site, and we'll send the link across. But to start us off, we've snipped together some sections from each to kind of provoke, to set up interest areas, and to speak to each other. So we will play that to you now.
I don't think it has ever been as important as it is today to champion the great impact that universities have on our society. Universities have a profoundly positive impact on the world through their educational programs, of course, through their work in the community, through their inventions, their innovations, and through their groundbreaking discoveries. Universities drive regional and national economies. More profoundly, they help us to understand what it is to be human. They make the world a better place. But despite this unquestionable and to me absolutely obvious public good, universities in many parts of the world seem to be under attack. Across the continents, populist politicians are questioning the very worth of our higher education institutions. And perversely, the pandemic has promoted and empowered the forces seeking to denigrate universities.
I think increasingly the community expects us to harness our research in ways that address the really complex, difficult issues that our local community faces, that our country faces, and that our region and the world faces. I think that's a really deep, fundamental shift that's occurring, not only in Australia, but across the world. We just know that whether it's climate change, whether it's global poverty and social dislocation and alienation, whether it's the rise of an impact of technology, of course, things like the global pandemic, we just know that governments, firms, and indeed universities can't address those problems on their own.
Perhaps the question we need to examine is instead, how can universities meaningfully contribute to the SDG process without unintendedly contributing to further injustices? And that is the need to decolonize development and its knowledge base. That is the way we think about development, the actions taken in its pursuit, and the indicators we use to monitor progress. The role of the university in propelling the SDGs is not about providing abstract global solutions. We need to cultivate spaces of and for epistemic justice.
The SDGs are based on an unfounded optimism that the current economic model can help us achieve a just and sustainable world. So we need to question that model. The SDGs also are inattentive to questions of culture, language, knowledge traditions, and those also need to be incorporated into our vision. So I would argue that the university also needs to be at the forefront of helping us reimagine that framework.
I think that UCL has the responsibility to respond to student demands, but more fundamentally, as an authoritative actor in the fields of teaching and research, I think UCL must advance efforts for the SDGs and have an active voice in both national and global sustainability debates. However, there is definitely a limit of what academics can do to drive forward our learning in the classroom when it comes to sustainability. Of course, they do control what happens directly in the classroom, but I think it's equally as important to think of the informal curriculum, what happens outside of the classroom, students' real-life experiences.
Universities have already been and will be increasingly part of not only the implementation of the SDGs on their campuses, I would say that's a relatively easy thing to do, but actually working with the cities and communities in which they're embedded, in the regions and the countries in which they're actually working, to not only influence what's happening in practices now, but to educate, train and influence a new generation of researchers, of academics, of learners, and activists and practitioners who will make the SDGs possible in the sort of 10 years that we have to make that happen.
Okay, so there's a lot in there to get us started. And also I can just see from the poll that you're sending into us as the audience where you're joining us from today, welcome. There's a huge amount of diversity and different countries represented here, people from Sheffield to Nepal. And we've got about 500 people joining us today. So thank you and welcome to you all. Please do send in questions. We're doing as much as we can to make it feel like a real life conference where you can put up your hand and ask questions. Okay, so there's a lot there to get us started in the video that you guys saw. So to give us some kind of structure to this session, we've split it up broadly into different segments, and these are based on the different roles that universities can take up and are increasingly called to take up in their communities and in the world. And I'll give an example. One of the reasons that I get up in the morning, get out of bed, and why I come to work at UCL's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose is I feel we hold a really interesting hybrid position and multiple roles. We're a teaching department, we're a research department in a very traditional sense, but we also work to get our hands dirty. We work with governments, with organizations, public and private sector around the world to get our research out there into practice and do what we call practice-based theorizing, learn from the application of research. And the ultimate aim from my point of view is to rethink and to reimagine concepts of what we call value in the economy, what we call public value, what we think of as private value, and how can you reorient these questions of value towards taking on society's biggest challenges, towards the SDGs. So the SDGs as such come into the heart of my everyday work, of our everyday work and of projects. For example, we're working with organizations like the Biscay government in northern Spain on an SDG-oriented tax policy, which is a really interesting world first tax policy. And we're working with governments from Italy to South Africa, some of the countries that you flagged as being from in the poll, to transform these global goals into real, actionable, mission-oriented policy-making tools and set long-term goals, bringing together different sectors, bringing together bottom-up and top-down solutions in our kind of work around innovation and economics. So that's how it affects my everyday life. And I can see I'm really interested to understand what are the different roles of a university. So I think we'll start with a shout out to the audience to get to see ourselves perhaps from the outside. What is the role of a university? What would you say the role is? And there's a poll going up right now that can help you feedback what you think the role of a university is today. I'll just wait a few minutes to get back some answers from the audience before we share them. This is super, thank you so much. There's some really good stuff coming in. So education coming up strongly, not a surprise there. I think that's what people would maybe think of as the traditional role of a university. Innovation's coming in strong, which is really great to hear. That's what I think of as a university's work as well. Public service, global impact, teaching, yes, that makes sense. Transformational change, I like that one. they're all bobbing all over the place. Simulate creative thinking, solve global problems. Okay, well, I'm glad we're all here to think about the university in that kind of context. I think it's really, yeah, it's great to hear so many different answers coming back. And I like the top three we've got really are innovation, research, and education. So let's kind of start with education. I think we'll start with the idea that, you know, maybe it's the most traditional one. You know, universities are teaching and learning organizations. They are rooms full of students. They are rooms full of researchers teaching students. And so I'd really like to start off with a student herself, with Tanya Dudnikova, one of our UCL alumna, and just bring in her kind of point of view to kick us off. So Tanya, what is it, do you think, that students want from universities that are engaging with their SDGs?
Hi there. Yeah, so just to quickly introduce myself, so I just graduated this summer, which was a very, very interesting time to graduate, as you can imagine, and also kind of ties in with a lot of what we're saying, because obviously the pandemic, I think, made me personally, at least, actually rethink the way in which, you know, I think about my education and the role of it, because obviously when you can't have this kind of physical space of university, we're all gathering together in one place, I think it does make you also rethink what is actually the purpose of this, you know, when you are graduating without, actually my graduation is today, and it's going to be an online one. So again, it kind of makes you think, what is the purpose of this, and how is my education actually being impacted when there is no physical place for us all to congregate? But no, Martha, I think that's a fantastic question. And I think, yeah, I think a lot of the audience answers are really, really brilliant. And you're all stealing my fantastic points. I think it is fantastic that innovation is coming up so high. I think, yeah, you know, obviously traditionally we'd say education research, but I think innovation is a really, really important one to consider when it comes to the SDGs, because I think, you know, they invite such a breadth of conversation. And I think the SDGs really like make us think about how everything around us is evolving all the time with things like the pandemic. I think they really invite us to be adaptive to our environment, which I think is where innovation comes in. I think also things like leadership are super important when it comes to the student voice being active and being heard in this kind of SDG debate. So I think what I would expect from UCL as a graduate now is I'd expect them to give me the skills to go away and actually be able to do things like this, which I think is really, really fantastic. I don't know, that's kind of what all new students maybe think about when they're first coming to university. But at least now as a graduate, that's definitely something that's really, really important to me, as opposed to just obviously a normal educational framework where I go away and I get my degree and I get my certificate and that's it.
Thanks, Tanya, and huge congratulations to you and your cohort. I hope you have a good
very much
graduation today, if a little bit unorthodox. Tristan, I want to bring you in here just to kind of respond to this. You're from the Institute of Education. I know you have thoughts more widely than this, but what would you respond to how Tanya's kind of reframing what students want from a university?
Yeah, I think she's made some great points. I mean, it's a really complex thing. Teaching the SDGs. I mean, quite often you see these declarations, that state, well, that's what we need to do. So we just reorient our institutions. It's a really complex thing. I mean, conventionally, we can divide these kinds of things into knowledge, skills, and values. So we might want to think of it like that. So we've got the knowledge aspect. We have the actual framework of the 17 SDGs we could learn about. Within each of those, we can understand the facts and so forth. We've got the skills, professional skills, academic skills, but also importantly, political skills. So things like public speaking that we're talking about today, campaigning and so forth. And then you've got the whole set of values. How do you actually foster a commitment to sustainable development? And this is probably the most complex of all. Some people don't even think it's the place of the university to promote values. I think in the contemporary era, when we're looking at a massified, in some cases universalized system, a third of the global cohort going, the values element is important, but it's an extremely complex thing. I mean, you can't just sort of exhort people to adopt values and magically it happens. And I think, the most coherent way of doing that for an institution is just to embody the kinds of principles that you're actually espousing. So if an institution can actually show in its everyday workings that it's doing the kinds of things that are aligned with the SDGs in relation to the environment, energy usage and so forth, those aspects, but also the human relations side, if we're thinking about gender equality, actually embodying that in the everyday workings, then I think we've got a lot better chance of promoting those kinds of values. But at the end of the day, I think we do need to acknowledge and even embrace the fact that learning is unpredictable. And serendipitous, and you can't actually be sure what people are going to come out with. You know, some of these frameworks, the competency-based frameworks, assume that we can sort of predefine these things, and we're going to have these students coming out in a particular mold. And I think we need to recognize that we need to move to a different kind, you know, more of a process-based model where, you know, we create the right kind of environment, and that's about the classroom, but it's also about things outside the classroom that Tanya mentioned as well. It's about the experience, it's about being in cafes, it's about volunteering, about campaigning, and so forth. And I see it at the end of the day that the things we need are, you know, a space and a spark. I think you need a space to be able to reflect and deliberate, you know, and time to do those things. But you also need some kind of spark, some challenge or provocation, which might come from lecturers, it might come from the other students, or the ideas that are circulating that are going to allow people to make the deep transformation that's needed if we're going to move towards sustainable development.
Thanks. Yeah, I like that idea of the space and the spark. And I think the idea of serendipity and chance really feeds into what a lot of people are flagging as the role of university, which is to innovate. It's, as well as teaching, innovation and environment, you know, economic development and environmental growth need these kinds of innovation, you know, processes to happen. Phil, can I bring you in to respond to this question as well about, you know, what does it mean to be a teaching institution in the time of the SDGs?
Yeah, thank you, Martha. I think I like the sort of Humboldtian ideal of a university that did come out very clearly from the audience poll. This idea that teaching and research is done together, that students and academics are in a kind of shared journey in pursuit of truth. And that's where all that creativity and innovation that Tristan and Tanya spoke about. So I love that idealized model of universities as truth seekers. And I think that does make them, you know, society's critic and society's conscience. And I think if you accept universities in that role, it feels almost inevitable that the SDGs should permeate almost all teaching, especially if you also accept that more and more teaching has to be multidisciplinary, that we can't solve the world's big challenges, we can't create the sort of global citizens that we want without them having a really strong multidisciplinary view of the world. And I think if you accept all of those, it just feels like the SDGs would just be permeated throughout all of our teaching and learning. Critical thinking, truth seeking. So, you know, we're constantly looking at how we combat fake news, we combat climate denialism, we accept and challenge ideas that are being propagated by those of us who, or those people who are, you know, suggesting we might inject bleach to counter the coronavirus, for example. It should permeate everything. And I know the UN, the 75th anniversary, their economists put a report out just a few weeks ago, I think, that talk about the 5 global mega trends: it's climate change, inequalities, urbanization, population change, and technological revolution. And I just almost feel like they touch every single one of the 17 SDGs. And I think we almost can't avoid not having SDGs completely embedded across the whole curriculum. So not an add-on, not something that's a sort of optional extra, something that's fundamental to our education. So it's a bit of an idealistic view, but I think absolutely, I think that's the way we need to be heading as a global sector.
I would say the audience agrees with you. We're having a huge amount of questions coming in very specifically on the granularities of the curriculum, of university curriculums, and maybe even the school curricula as well. I wonder if anyone on the panel would like to respond to that. How can we actually, in practice, get the SDGs into that permeating role throughout the curriculum and throughout student life? Is there anyone who'd like to kind of take on that question?
I mean, I might jump in here, Martha. I mean, one thing we're thinking a lot about at Sydney, and when we think about the curriculum, we should also think about the kind of extracurricular environment within which the teaching sits. And I think turning your university into a kind of living lab within which students have a chance to kind of, in a sense, see, feel, touch, and contribute to what it means to be in a sustainable environment more generally all around them is a really powerful, I guess, motivator for how an education is perceived, and picking up on some of Tanya's points, you know, how you actually respond to the world you're living amongst. So curricula, all kinds of opportunities. We know that there'll be a kind of, you know, demand thing. Students will want and demand that their courses reflect the challenges of global sustainability. They'll want to know about their region. They'll want to know about the environment they're in. But I think the other thing that we need to be thinking about and doing, and it'll come up later, I'm sure, is, you know, universities need to turn themselves into sustainability living labs. You know, the way we think about our waste, the way we think about water, the way we think about how we operate every day on campus is critical. And there is a really deep, I think, educational aspect to it as well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, universities are, they are places where thinking happens. They are Humboldtian places where we search for truth. And I love that idea of bringing that back to the kind of core of what we're talking about. But they're real places too. They're mini towns. They take up whole chunks of our cities and of our rural areas. And so they do have this opportunity, as you say, Duncan, to really to work through, like a town would, interlinked ecosystem problems. And I think they also have a responsibility and almost kind of reputational role to do so. If you don't, you know, you have to look at your own sustainability plans, your own kind of nuts and bolts sustainability, waste, recycling, you know, ways of doing things, as well as experimenting together with your students towards the new. Adriana, I'd love to bring you. Oh, yeah.
I was just going to say very quickly, and also to argue about it, right? I mean, there's a lot of disagreement. Yeah. I mean, it's not as though everything's hunky-dory and everyone agrees on what the consequences of a sustainable planet, world, city, town, university campus is. So I think we also have to learn how to engage in those deep disagreements and figure it out and disagree well in the process.
Absolutely. And I think once you get down beyond the SDGs, down to the different indicators of the SDGs, some of them end up bumping up against each other in terms of prioritization, in terms of taking you in different economic directions, which is a really interesting debate to have within a kind of ecosystem like university. Adriana, I'm going to bring you in now to kind of respond to this as well, if that's all right.
Sure. No, just reflecting on what has been said, I think that is also important when we're talking about the role of the university, to remind ourselves that universities are the product of the very societies that they are supposed or meant to change. And that poses quite difficult questions. So, of course, you know, we have great ambitions and goals and so on, but we work within a particular type of political economy that constrains the realization of those goals in many ways. And I think that we also have to be very honest about that. Now I'm thinking in, for instance, in the case of European universities, we still work very much within the framework of the Bologna Accord that makes, you know, universities respond very much to the marketplace in many ways. So again, it's not to play down at all the very important ethical and political role that universities can play, but just to remind ourselves as well about some of the boundaries of the political economy that we face. I noticed that there was a lot in terms of the, you know, what can we do through education? And I think that one of the most important things, going back to Tristan's point, in terms of, you know, just thinking and articulating knowledge, values, and skills, or I would speak more about capacities, even capacities to change the world. I think that one of the critical things is to really go deeper in more critical pedagogies. So it's difficult to think about, you know, students and teachers and teaching even and so on. I think that, you know, as we heard at the beginning, one of the most important things is to really make sense and support people and learners to make sense of both the codified and tacit knowledge, the knowledge of, you know, that you acquire and you work with in the classroom and outside the classroom. And I think that that takes us not only to innovation, to what new things we could do, but I think that to consider in that discussion and in relation to the SDGs, 4 different things. So one is a question of, you know, what to do and what innovation is required. But I think that we need to be very explicit about what not to do, a question that sometimes we don't have when we talk about innovation. Third, about the question of what we could do again. I mean, there are so many, you know, I know we face change in conditions, but there are so many important policies, ways about going change and so on in the past that somehow were disrupted that we might need to revisit. And of course, the question of what do we need to do differently. I stop here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a role for new making and for making new as well, to go back and see what's worked. And I think there's a comparative element, as Duncan was saying. If we're in a lab situation, we need to be comparing historically to now and across different campuses and different approaches, both in terms of teaching and in terms of other actions. Aromar, I'd love to bring you in here as well to have a comment on this.
Well, the thing is, just to pick up from where Adriana left off, see, the SDGs and universities themselves are not only about environmental and ecological sustainability. They're centrally about social questions and economic questions. So, questions of social justice, questions of class and economic justice are absolutely central. The world is currently in deep crisis. And, I was speaking to the General Assembly just 3 days ago, and what we were saying was that what we are seeing today with COVID is actually an SDG crisis. It started around health, but it's kind of permeated into pretty much everything, into poverty, into gender justice, into dealing with a whole range of crises. The only thing that might have improved in some places is, let's say, environmental conditions. So I think we really need to look at the university as embedded in social, political, and economic systems. And that's why the SDGs are so interesting. They relate to everyday life and the sort of operational crisis that we're dealing with, and knowledge as related to that. So if you're building knowledge around the way the world is actually working itself out, you couldn't be doing better than that. So curricula and actual action on the ground and knowledge is actually related very closely to that. So one mustn't forget that the SDGs are a bit of a mess because they're a political statement. I mean, we were involved in the negotiations. So we wanted to start with 10, so we could count them off on the fingers of each hand, and every child would know them. But the politics led them to becoming 17 and 169, this, that, the others. But that's the nature of life. And I think that's what universities have to sort of engage in, to try and reconstruct stuff to make sense in their own context.
Thanks so much. No, that's really interesting. I didn't know that they started as a kind of mnemonic on your hands, and then you have to now take off your shoes. So what I'm going to do, actually, I'm going to move to Tanya in a minute. I'd like her to kind of reflect back. We offered it to her to start out this conversation. But I'm really also interested to hear from the audience. I wonder if we can set up a quick poll. What are their kind of key reflections coming back from this? What are the things that universities can do in a kind of, we started out in a kind of teaching and learning sense, but we've definitely flourished out since then. But what are the key things they think, or the top thing they think universities should do to take on the SDGs from a kind of teaching point of view, whether that's curricular, whether that's about experimentation as a living lab organization? That would be great to hear from the audience. And in the meantime, Tanya, do you want to come back in and talk us through where you're reflecting on from this discussion?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's been a really, really great discussion. I think the audience have raised a lot of really, really fantastic questions. As I'm sure you've seen, there's been so much about, we talk about integrating SDGs into the curriculum. How do you actually do that? I think there's a great question that came up quite recently as well in terms of, some subject areas are more obviously sort of aligned with the SDG rather than others. How does it work when it comes to things like literature and history? So my sort of educational background is in no way at all related to the SDGs. I did English literature and French, and that's actually a question that I often ask myself. I sadly don't have the answer, but I do think that we need to be posing these questions. I think it's very easy to talk about, let's make the curriculum as interdisciplinary as possible, let's integrate the SDGs. But when it comes to subjects such as literature, I think currently the framework doesn't necessarily allow for that integration. So I think we need to be thinking a bit more broadly. Is there kind of a fundamental incompatibility between the way that we as students are asked to think about education now and the kind of quite narrow framework that maybe some courses, I think in particular, place us in, and then this kind of the breadth of interdisciplinary, thought that the SDGs actually invite. So yeah, I think currently, sadly, this integration isn't maybe as kind of possible in the practical sense as we'd like it to be. And I think that's where, again, as we've mentioned before, I think that's where extracurriculars come in. So for example, for me personally, that was, what kind of my engagement started, and that's been what's been inspiring me. And I think, again, as we discussed with the pandemic, I think it really makes us question again, how are we going to rethink extracurricular activities now when we don't have that physical space of a university campus? When we're talking about this living lab, how does that actually look in a world where we might all be scattered across the world? How do we foster these connections? How do we incentivize students to get involved in these extracurricular activities now? Because obviously it's going to be quite a lot harder, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my undergraduate was English literature as well. And I can see that when you come out of that kind of degree, that's very much driven by kind of, you do a lot of reading, then you kind of come out and you ask, how does this apply to everything around me? And I think it's a really interesting point of how do you bake that in, but also provide the kind of robust extracurricular activities that support students both to reflect back into their work and to think more widely. Tristan, I think I have a hand up from you as well. Do you want to come in and comment on this? And thank you all. Thanks for all the reflections coming in from the audience. Yeah, this is great. There's a lot about innovation, which is fabulous to hear, because that's where I work. There's a lot about working with governments, disseminating research. And yeah, I like the idea up here that someone's been saying we should really walk the walk. Absolutely. Tristan, do you want to come in?
Yeah, it's a really important point that's been raised there by Tanya about different disciplinary areas in teaching. It's very important to address this issue. And I mean, it links in also with the research question, which we'll be talking about later. I mean, I just recently saw a paper that analysed funding for climate change research, and only 10% of that funding goes to social sciences, let alone arts and humanities. And of course, it's absolutely essential that we have the engineering, natural sciences, and so forth. But if we're thinking about teaching it, it absolutely needs to be embedded within those subjects, in addition to any kind of extracurricular activities, because we are talking about a humanity and models of living. And so it gets to the heart of absolutely everything that we think and do. Including in literary studies and history and so forth. So we're thinking about an actual shift of paradigm of the way human beings relate to each other and to the world. So it's essential that we think about that. And that links in with the epistemic question about pluralism and knowledge traditions, which I'm sure we'll come back to in this discussion as well, about decolonization and diversity of views, indigenous knowledge and so forth, which is also really important to address here, and to go beyond, medicinal plants and so forth, and to think actually about different ways of viewing the world, different ways of understanding how we acquire and share knowledge, and how we view ourselves as beings.
Yeah, we definitely have time put aside to speak about that. I mean, as Aromar said, this is a political decision-making process that got us to the SDGs, but they're global problems and they often manifest in global southern countries. So it'll be really interesting to talk through that epistemic question. And I think I had a hand up from Duncan as well, just to round off this section, although we don't have to round it off, we can just keep going. But Duncan, it's over to you.
Look, no, I was just in relation to Tanya's and Tristan's point about the humanities and social sciences and the SDGs. I mean, just an example. I mean, I think this is a role that universities have, especially comprehensive universities like UCL or my own. I mean, in the terrible bushfires in Australia in December and January, we had a workshop at the university. I think there was still kind of smoke in the air on the day of the workshop, but out of that came a really, I think, powerful recognition of the need for the humanities and social sciences and the engineering and science disciplines to engage in new ways. So one thing that came out, for example, was a project on taking the oral histories of communities on the East Coast that had been terribly burned out during the fires that occurred, and that's just generated a whole range of interesting opportunities. So, we have to work at it. You have to be purposeful, and again, I think that is something that universities have to get better at, and release some of the grip of disciplines on on our imagination and the way we operate as institutions.
Yeah, I think that makes a huge amount of sense, and I like the idea of that kind of breaking free of where it's very path dependent. We've built ourselves up to a certain way of thinking about how disciplines interact. You apply to a certain course and you take that course, but it doesn't need to be like that. We can rethink how that plays in. And I think it's kind of what you just brought up really feeds into the next university role that I want to spend some time exploring around universities as physical, geographical places that are set in a space that maybe invite international students, but are very much set within their community and their location. And I want to kind of start with you, Aromar, actually, and bring you in here, because I know that IIHS, as you mentioned, played a role in developing out SDG 11 with the aim for cities and human settlements to be inclusive, to be safe, to be resilient, and be sustainable. So I'm really interested to hear your reflections on this question of how do you be a university that acts on the SDGs from the point of view of being in place and space, being a place of human settlement as well?
So, I mean, we are a slightly different sort of to a traditional university. We was established to help shepherd one of the largest transitions that we'll see this century, which is basically the urbanization we'll see in South Asia. So, about 300 to 400 million new people coming into urban areas, 800 million people being in that space, a complete shift in culture from a rural sort of patriarchal, hierarchical culture into one that's urban with, potentially different imaginations. So it made sense for us because there's a connection between this and globalization to get deeply involved in the negotiations around the SDGs. And one of the challenges of the SDG frame, even as it exists at the moment, is that it's organized in the way that governments are organized. So it's organized by sector, but action, implementation, change happens in communities and around places. So the introduction of sort of all the spatialization or the localization of the SDGs was really the agenda that we worked on. And it was interesting. I mean, people don't necessarily know this, but the framing actually came from academics. And then it went into this complex engagement with countries and cities and processes like that. And it was a hop, skip, and jump pretty much across the world. I mean, remember the last thing that we did was there was a consultation in London, which we brought together people, including colleagues from UCL, and then in Sweden and then in India, to frame and outline how this can sort of work itself out. And interestingly, because the framing was the way it was, and we had taken into account some of the, let's say, the political economy of process, what you see today was what we, in a sense, sat and negotiated among themselves. So, like I said earlier, the questions of epistemic justice and its connection with social, ecological, or environmental and sort of economic justice are embedded into that frame. So it's the challenge, of course, beyond that is you've got a framework, it's politically agreed. How do you actually implement this? And how do you make that happen? And that is really the big tension we're facing at the moment. Because like you're saying in COVID, the implementation is happening with local and regional governments, but the power is sitting with national governments, fine? And national governments are not, they don't really like giving up either resources or people or money. So this is, in a sense, a deep political battle. And that's why, this question of the humanities and social sciences, absolutely central, because these changes we're talking about are changes that we expect to happen, let's say in the case of climate, in the next 15 or 20 years. Because if we don't make that change, we're going to be in deep trouble. The issue, of course, which is the issue of history and of literature, is how in the past or how in the present have these changes actually been made? This is something that, I'm trained as a technologist, I work on legal questions. These are things that those disciplines are unable to actually grapple with. So the question of grounding in space, the role of the university as a catalyst in space and in community is absolutely central. You can't, you're not a sort of island or whatever it is, it's a temple on top of the hill. You're in the middle of the real world today. And if you don't make the change, it will change you.
Absolutely, and I would advise the audience to go and check out Aromar's video after this as well, where he explains some of the role that the IIHS has played a bit more widely. And so two other people who really engaged with these concepts that are being brought up around shift, around transition, around power shifts, I think, in their videos are Tristan and Adriana as well. And I'd love to throw it out to you, this question of what is the role of universities in implementing the SDGs at this kind of place, space? And it's difficult because you have, it's multi-layer. You start at local, place and space, but you always end up spinning out into global interactions, global trends. So I'd love you to reflect on that. And maybe Adriana, I'll bring you in first to think about that.
Sure, Martha, thanks. Just building upon what Aro was saying, I think that perhaps a first big role has to do with pushing and rethinking the boundaries of the SDGs themselves. And I think about, I'm playing obviously with the title for this conference, but I think that that's crucial. And I see the thinking or pushing the boundaries at least in three different ways. One, highlighted by Aro, has obviously to do with the sort of somehow sectorial organization of the world that is somehow, transparent in the 17 SDGs. And of course, we know that there are synergies, but there are also trade-off across the SDGs and sometimes even within the SDGs. So we do need to work across that, because we could be otherwise even implementing the separate SDGs with very schizophrenic outcomes. So that's quite important. A second important thing has to do with the aspirations themselves as well that are embodied in the SDGs. And I think that in some cases we find a push, say, for instance, with regards to the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, environmental questions, climate change, and so on, is much more embedded across all the SDGs, but still there are important silences. And I think that one is definitely the silence on justice. Again, the language of justice is not explicitly used, although all the SDGs are about affecting some form, different forms of environmental and social justice. But But we also find in some cases some very important omissions. I'm thinking, for instance, if you look at SDG 8, the focus is on economic growth, promotion of economic growth, and then you will see an effort to also talk to, you know, the informal sector, the employment for the youth, gender equality, and so on, but no mention at all of this solidarity economy. And this is very important. So it's not only about growing and so on. So there is, in some cases, aspirations that are problematic. And I think that we need to push for those. The third level, the third type of boundary that I think that we need to be very mindful has to do with the geography of the SDGs. If we think about them, the bulk, not only, but the bulk of the positive impacts and outcomes that we are trying to pursue through the SDGs has quite a lot of relevance and has to speak to the reality of the so-called Global South. And yet, you know, how we engage with the Global South, you know, in not just in the implementation, in the, you know, of a solution, but in the whole definition, you know, of a minimal process of implementation is crucial. In that sense, again, when we go back to the role of what universities can do, I think that a first important activity has to do with aligning much more the tangible and intangible impacts of what we do. So it is about the content, but it's very much about what we practice. And I think in here, for instance, we are used to see universities adopting sustainability campus plans and so on, which is very good news. But I think that we need to go beyond the idea that, you know, having an impact on the place, you know, on the environment and so on, can be just restricted to, for instance, divest from fossil fuels or make our buildings like UCL has, you know, zero carbon, zero plastic and so on. There is far more to that. And I think that we do need to engage in parallel. For instance, I think one important element has to do with also anticipating the unintended consequences of universities' investments. I mean, universities' investments have a huge responsibility, for instance, in generating processes of displacement, gentrification, and so on. And we cannot react like we didn't know that. We know that that happens. So we need to anticipate those. A second point in relation to what to do or what to do differently for me has to do with going beyond the call for multi or interdisciplinarity. I think that that's a minimum we should aspire for, but I think that we have to work in a transdisciplinary way. And that takes us back to this very important relationship between, you know, how do we work, you know, with others on matters, you know, say from a Northern university, in matters that have global impacts, in matters that are embedded in completely different elsewheres and across very different geographies. So I think that the issue of transdisciplinarity is crucial, and that in simple terms, it means, you know, obviously, how do we ask the questions that guide our research? It's not only about the co-production, you know, when we come to the field and so on. It's very much about the very formulation of those questions and their implementation. So I think that, you know, to conclude, I think that in a way, we do have to keep on pushing from this idea of being a university to practice a much more pluriverse way of doing research, doing teaching, and so on. And that has to acknowledge, you know, that universities don't hold, you know, the truth, are not the only producers of knowledge. They are one among many others. There are many other knowledges that need to be acknowledged, valued, and so on. And we need to talk to them in a much more agile way than we actually do right now.
Adriana, I love that, but it throws up so many questions. Like, I've just thrown up 3 different areas of questions coming from what you're talking about. In a minute, I'm going to ask Phil to come in, but firstly, I'd just like all of the panel, I'm going to ask a subsequent question to just think about. So Adriana pointed out the kind of investments, the high consumption activities that are undertaken by universities. Can universities, as relatively high consumption activities, you know, we're not making steel, but we do consume, and we do consume space as well as energy. Can the activity be sustainable, and do the benefits of universities that detract perhaps from some of these sustainability goals? And actually, I've circulated this within the environment or the energy space, but more broadly, do the elements of universities that detract from the SDGs get weighed out by those that support the SDGs currently? So that's my question for a minute, but in a minute, I'm firstly just going to bring in Phil to respond because he's had his hand up.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, just to go back to that point about universities as, you know, deeply embedded parts of their communities, in their situations. I think we'll talk a little bit later about the role of metrics and the role of rankings and the sort of consumer power that can be asserted there. But just to mention actually the Times Higher Education impact rankings, which are framed entirely around the 17 SDGs, 17 individual rankings. We have a theory of change where we of course look at university teaching, of course we look at university research, their contribution to new knowledge, but we also look at outreach, how far they're working with NGOs and charities and governments around the world. But the key bit, the final bit, which I think is really game changing in terms of the comment that was made on Slido about walking the walk, is that we evaluate universities on their stewardship of their own resources and their own assets. So of course, when it comes to climate change, we will look at whether they have, environmentally friendly policies on campus, whether they're, consuming energy in a responsible way, what they're doing to offset their carbon footprints, etc. But the thing that I think is really powerful is that we judge them across all of the SDGs. So when we're looking at decent work in economic growth, for example, I think it's SDG 8, we're asking them about how their own employment practices. Do they pay the minimum wage? Do they have proper union recognition in place? How much casualization do they have? When it comes to equalities, we're looking at the student intake. Are they actually diversifying their intake? Are they widening access and encouraging social mobility? Gender, we challenge them on the proportion of senior female leaders, for example, and on ethnic diversity as well. So I'm really like the fact that we're collecting data for the first time that holds the institutions account for their own stewardship of their own affairs and their own responsibilities. So I think that sits very much within the broader framework of as one of the comments said earlier, walking the walk, putting their money where their mouth is, as well as contributing to the new knowledge that will be fundamental to finding solutions and ensuring that we can address the SDGs.
Thanks. And that also with the concept of metrics and rankings does speak back to the question I was posing a little bit, the idea that, universities take up a lot of they consume highly in terms of resources. They have histories which are not so necessarily meritocratic as they are just educating the same people that they've educated for hundreds of years and not contributing to social mobility potentially, or maybe that's the landscape here in the UK to some degree. So can I pose this wider question for the whole panel? How can we think of universities as kind of net positive or on the SDGs? Like, are there things that we need to, activities that detract from the SDGs that we need to get kind of weighted out by those which are positive, moving towards kind of sustainability over the long term? Throwing that out to the floor. Aroma, I think you might want to respond on that.
So quickly, I mean, it's fairly simple in one way. Universities are places where we teach, we research, we practice, we live and work. So if we don't actually put all of this stuff into practice there, how can we teach or inspire? It's very simple in some ways. So if you come and see what we try and do here in India, of course, it's very contextual. We have the largest population of poor people in the country. We have large numbers of people who are sort of underemployed or unemployed. So we have to integrate that context into what we're doing this now. So when we track what Phil was saying, we track how much employment we can generate, in the first order and the second order. It's very important for us because otherwise we're not doing very much. So I guess the integration of real life and these transformations into the business practice, into the teaching and the research is kind of central to what we're doing. So whether it's net positive carbon, which we're doing, reduction of footprints, reduction of water consumption, which is very critical. You have to walk the talk. Otherwise, young people today are not going to be willing to listen to you because they can see the world. This is a world of the climate emergency and of a whole range of other things. And they might be, I think they're very much in a place where they're able to take stuff in their own hands and say, look, if you don't teach us about this, we'll teach ourselves. It's almost, I would say, a 68 moment at the current point of time.
Tanya, I'd love to hear your views on this. Are we at a 68 moment for students finding out about, young people are kind of more concerned about the climate crisis than the older generations, and then they have been before, which is, forms part of the SDGs. Are we at a 68 moment, would you say?
Perhaps. I mean, I do think that, there definitely are examples of that happening. And I think it's fantastic sometimes to have the younger generation, take the reins into their own hands. I think, again, that's a fantastic example of you know, the fact that they have learned leadership, they have learned these skills, that they are actually able to drive their own learning outside of the classroom, or perhaps put pressure onto, I don't know, academics, anyone older generation. But at the same time, I don't think that's necessarily a reflection of a positive thing. And I think that, you know, we keep going back to this idea that we need to change these larger frameworks. We need to start, obviously, bottom up is fantastic, but we do also need to do top to bottom, and kind of work on integrating the SDGs at all levels, ranging from students to academics, staff, but also the managerial team at the very, very top.
I think that's hugely important. And one thing I think that often gets overlooked in discussions about universities is the role of non-academic staff, and the role of professional services, the role of people who maintain and look after the buildings, especially now that we're not necessarily in the buildings. They still need all that work to be done. So I think it's really important that actually we think top to bottom, but as wide as possible. I think there'll be a great deal of demand. Yes. One of my AV team is saying, yes, AV staff as well, absolutely. I want to throw it over to Duncan, I think, who wants to come in on this one.
The only thing I was going to add, I mean, I think Tanya and Phil and Aro have all touched on this, but I think there is a fundamental point about universities just becoming more open as institutions, becoming more porous as institutions. And that's an easy thing to say, but I think it is quite a deep challenge for institutions that historically, culturally, politically, economically, and for not, you know, for good reasons, have seen themselves as slightly apart from society.